Hi, friends. Ms. Ray here. I just wanted to give you a bit of a Shakespeare overview, in addition to the lit chat that Mr. Hadley and I did, to just kind of introduce you to the bard himself, his life, as well as the three genres that he typically wrote in, which are comedy, history, and tragedies. So I'm going to take you through my William Shakespeare presentation and kind of talk through it with you as if you were with me in class with some slight adjustments. All right. So we'll hit the history. We'll talk a bit about literary terms as well. We'll be doing more work on the literary terms in the coming weeks. We'll talk about his genres, and I'll even let you know about some film adaptations so you can seek out some trailers to get a little bit of an idea of just how Shakespeare can be adapted today. So before you jump into Shakespeare, and you don't need to do this as a free write, I just want you to kind of do it as a brainstorm and something to think about, is think about your experience with Shakespeare so far. What have you read? If you haven't read anything, what movie adaptations have you seen of Shakespeare's works? Think about if you've ever seen any live theater of Shakespeare plays and how those plays turned out for you and what your thoughts were. And think about what your impressions are of Shakespeare. Students often come into my class feeling a little bit apprehensive or intimidated because when first opening one of Shakespeare's plays, it may look like it's not even written in English because of that iambic pentameter and that different style and that Elizabethan language. So I know that it can be intimidating for many. So think about how you're feeling going into it. Conversely, some students have been in Shakespeare plays before, so they come in a lot more comfortable. So just kind of check in with yourself about how you're feeling and know that regardless of if you're super excited and jazzed to do this and looking forward to it, or if you're terrified, either of those feelings are valid. All right. So some history. Shakespeare was born roughly on April 26, 1564. We don't know for sure. We know that that was the day that he was baptized. They didn't keep records of birth at the time. Honestly, so many infants didn't make it. There just would be too much public record of an infant that was then going to die just a few days later. But we do know he was baptized on April 26. So a lot of historians like to hypothesize that he was born on April 23rd because that would nicely bookend his death. He would die on his birthday. Happy birthday, Shakespeare. But 26 was when he was baptized. So we know that it was just a few days earlier that he was born. We do have baptismal records. He was born and raised in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is a little town on the Avon River in England. And at age 18, he married 26-year-old Anne Hathaway. Not the beautiful actress Anne Hathaway, but instead actually kind of a plain woman who was considered below his station. She was pregnant at the time of their marriage, so it was a little bit of a shotgun wedding. He did have 3 children. One of them, Hamnet, died at the age of 11. Again, health and treatments weren't what they are today, so it was not uncommon for infants and children to die of what would seemingly today be like common colds or things like that. So his son Hamnet did die at age 11. It is hypothesized that the play Hamlet was written to kind of express how Shakespeare felt about the death of his son, as we see this character Hamlet kind of fall into a deep depression after the death of his father. Okay, so here's a picture of Shakespeare's home in Stratford-upon-Avon. It is, of course, as most homes of famous people now are, a museum. And here's a picture of Anne Hathaway. Sexy. All right, the theater. Shakespeare likely began writing plays in the mid-1580s. Again, likely because records weren't kept then in the same way that they are now, but we can start to look at when his plays were performed and then backtrack from there of when they were written. Initially, they were performed only by a troupe known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Actors and playwrights had to be sponsored by someone who was in the House of Lords. So they were always titled things like Lord Blank's Men or Lord Blank's Players. So these were the Lord Chamberlain's Men. That was his acting troupe. And you'll notice that it says men, not players and not people. And that's because only men were allowed to perform in the theater and perform on the stage. It was considered improper for a woman to be on the stage or to be an actor. It was just not acceptable. And it wasn't actually acceptable until a few more eras of theater passed us. And we got to that, I believe it's the Restoration, when we get the women start to appear on stage. So all men on stage, that means the role of women were played by men, typically by younger men who perhaps had higher voices. They would often play the roles of women, unless the role was a comedic woman, in which place they would want to kind of take almost a like a drag race aspect on it and have kind of just a burly man playing the woman, because they wanted it to just add to the comedy of it. So that kind of campy aspect existed already back then. Shakespeare's troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, commonly performed in the Globe Theatre, which was built in 1599. In fact, one of the versions of Romeo and Juliet we've made available to you is a production that is in the Globe modern day after it was rebuilt from a fire. So here's a picture of what the Lord Chamberlain's Men might have looked like. Obviously, not the real Lord Chamberlain's Men. But if you look closely, you might notice that here our female character is being played by a man. Oftentimes we see Shakespeare productions still doing that to kind of give that homage to the theater of the past. All right, the Globe Theatre was the theater where they performed their works. The plays were meant for the general public. So even though it had to be sponsored by someone in the House of Lords, and also it had to get past kind of the aristocracy, Shakespeare did write for the general public. And we called those general public groundlings because they stood and watched from the courtyard or the pit. So if you look at this image, you'll see all these people crowded around on the floor of what is the modern day Globe Theater. Those would be the groundlings. And hundreds of people could squeeze in down here to watch the plays. And those were rowdy crowds. It wasn't like the quiet, still theater goer that we see today. And then in the upper ring, around the outside, this upper crest, that's where we would have the aristocracy sit. So the groundlings were able to buy tickets for just a penny to come into the theater and then have a raucous good time. You'll notice that it is an open air theater. It opens up to the sky. There is no artificial lighting because of that. They would use flames sometimes for footlights, but typically plays could occur in the daytime, no problem. Also, you have to think of weather, right? The show must go on. So regardless, the shows would go on regardless of what the weather looked like. All right, you're going to come across some words in Romeo and Juliet. I just want to kind of let you know what some of these mean because you'll see them all the time. An or and mean if. Anon is soon. So if you hear a character say, I come, anon, anon, they're saying, I'm coming, I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. I, in a very piratey way, means yes. And but means except for. And then you'll see things like these two words, even and ever. Because he wrote an iambic pentameter, he had to fit words within a certain syllable count. He needed to have 5 iambs, so 5 pairs of syllables that were unstressed, stressed, to make a total of 10 syllables per line. So it is a poetic rhythm, a poetic meter. And so in order to sometimes remove a syllable, even becomes in, and ever becomes er. So you'll see that quite often in Shakespeare's writing. Some more, happily means perhaps, but happy means fortunate. So if there's a happy mistake, it's a fortunate mistake. Hence means away or from her, and hie means hurry. So if I say, hie thee hence, what I'm saying is, hurry, get away from her. Hie you hence, hie thee hence. And merry means indeed. Merry, I do believe it's a beautiful day outside. Whence means where. Wilt is will or will you. And again, right, by saying wilt instead of will you, we've elimited a syllable. Withal means in addition to or also. And would means wish. So I would that we were in the classroom right now would be me saying, I wish that we were in the classroom, which I totally do. I miss you all. All right, so those are just a few of the ones. Also, even though it's not on this PowerPoint, I'm going to hit you with one more word that is so often misunderstood, but will completely change the meaning of one of the most important lines in Romeo and Juliet, which is wherefore. Wherefore does not mean where. Wherefore means why. Why? So when we hear that famous line, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? She's not saying, where the heck are you? What she's saying is, Romeo, Romeo, why are you Romeo? And that becomes so incredibly important, as you'll see when you watch the play, when it comes to the story of those star-crossed lovers. It's his identity, not where he is. All right, some important things to consider in literary language. The first is blank verse. Blank verse is the poetic meter that much of Shakespeare's work, including Romeo and Juliet, is written in. It's unrhymed verse, so unless it's a rhyming couplet, which we'll also talk about, you won't see rhymes necessarily throughout. And he writes in iambs, which means it's an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So for example, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. We don't say, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. So you want to think of those stressed, unstressed syllables. And then pentameter tells us there are 5 metric feet to a line. So 5 iambs, each iamb 2 syllables. A little bit of algebra lets us know that each line has 10 syllables. Prose, in contrast to blank verse, is ordinary writing that's not poetry, drama, or song. So many books that we read are written as prose. Of Mice and Men, prose. To Kill a Mockingbird, prose. In the Time of the Butterflies, prose. Shakespeare, blank verse. But Shakespeare does use prose sometimes in his writing. Typically, it's if someone is speaking who is in a very lower class or who is completely drunk. You will then see that character speaking in prose. It kind of sets them apart. It gives a contrast of the other character speaking and kind of lets us know where they fall on that social pyramid. The plot, much like any text, is the sequence of events. No change here for Shakespeare. And we have some pretty basic plot structure. We start with the exposition, which will introduce the setting, the characters, and the basic situation. Now you'll notice in the exposition of this text, you're going to start with the chorus giving us the prologue that's going to give us essentially the whole story so that we have a bit of a preview of what we'll be reading, but it will start with the most important exposition. The 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. So right now we already know our setting, Verona, Italy, and we know some of our basic situation. There's 2 households, they're both alike in dignity. So we have that's the base group of characters. And then it goes on from ancient grudge break to new mutiny where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. This tells us ancient grudge breaks into new fighting. Civil blood makes civil hands unclean. We're getting an idea of what's happening in Verona. So we get more of that basic situation. From forth the fatal loans of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventures, piteous overthrows, do with their death bury their parents' strife. We then also meet, even before we've met them as characters on stage, we know that we are going to meet 2 star-crossed lovers, 2 unlucky lovers who are being tormented by fate because they can't be with each other, and that eventually they will take their lives. So it's like, no spoilers, Shakespeare, but we essentially have the overall plot before we even start to watch the play itself. All right, following the exposition is the inciting moment or the initial incident, kind of the first bit of action that's going to set everything else into play. We'll see a variety of conflicts, which are the struggles that exist in the plot. Shakespeare is a big fan of a conflict in all of his writing, both tragedies and comedies. We see man versus man, so like a character versus a character. Man versus self, if there's like an internal struggle, we see quite a few of those. Man versus society, and man versus nature. Another one that Shakespeare adds, and it's kind of part of that nature, is man versus the supernatural. So we see man versus fates, man versus God, all falls within that man versus the supernatural. That also exists. We then get to the crisis, which is the point where the protagonist or protagonists' situation gets either better or worse. Because this is a tragedy, we can assume it's going to get worse. And that leads to the climax, which is our turning point. Everything begins to unravel. In Shakespeare's comedies, it's in a very slapsticky, silly way where, oh my goodness, look at all this chaos. Those are his comedies, but in his tragedies, we see that turning point be something that's much more kind of gripping, suspenseful, makes the audience feel something. And that leads to the resolution, which is the end of the central conflict. Following the resolution, we get the denouement, which is your final explanation of the outcome after the plot. So it's after the resolution. So I like to compare it to like a modern day denouement would be Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. We end the epic battle of Hogwarts. We're at the end, we're done. And then we get to hear what happens when they're adults. So we get kind of an idea of how it all turns out after the story is over. So that's your denouement, how it all turns out after the central conflict has been resolved. So much like any story, the central idea, the central message is the theme. You can pick quite a few themes out of this text, Romeo and Juliet. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the types of characters we will meet. So a dramatic foil is a character whose purpose is to show off some aspect of another character. So for example, when we meet very depressed, sad Romeo in Act 1, You have very upbeat and happy Mercutio who counters him. His sheer joy and happiness really counters Romeo's sadness and depression, so it helps to show that off. We have round characters and flat characters. A round character one might call well-rounded. They have many personality traits, many different aspects to their personality that we get to see, whereas a flat character is completely one-dimensional. They're often used for comic relief. We don't see variety of personality traits there, just one part. Static and dynamic characters are also different. Static characters are unchanging throughout the story. They stay the same, whereas dynamic characters may somehow change during the story, generally for the better, typically in literature. However, we can certainly see dynamic characters change for the worse, especially in some of Shakespeare's real great tragedies. We see the change happen for the worse. A few literary and dramatic devices to think of, and we'll do some more work with these as well in the coming week. The first, a monologue, is one person speaking on stage. Also, a soliloquy is one person speaking on stage, but the difference between the two is that a soliloquy is the expression of thoughts aloud, so the other characters cannot hear it. It's like you're just talking to yourself. Kind of think of it as a voiceover. Whereas a monologue, it's like a speech that one character is giving, but other characters are able to think about it or are able to hear it. So a soliloquy, internal monologue spoken aloud, whereas a monologue is spoken aloud to others. So that's your big difference there. We kind of get a peek inside the characters' heads when we get their soliloquies. An aside is spoken in an undertone and is not intended to be heard by all characters. I am going to share this presentation with you, so you can click on these links if you'd like to. But that Can Be Unspoken link gives you a little bit of a clip from The Office. So often in The Office, Jim will look directly at camera and kind of make a little face. That's an unspoken aside. But if I'm on stage and I have something that I want to say to another character that I don't want someone else to hear, I can give them an aside. So for example, if you think of Mean Girls, just to give you a modern day aside, when Regina is talking to Kate, she's with Katie, and a girl walks by and she has on, I think it's a skirt. She has on a skirt, I believe. And she says, "Oh my God, cute. I love it. I love your skirt." And then the girl walks away, and then Regina turns to Katie and says that it's the fuggliest skirt I've ever seen. That comment about the skirt being fugly is not meant to be heard by the other people in the hallway, just by Katie. So that is an aside. All right, he also loves puns. Shakespeare loves a pun. A pun is a word that has multiple meanings. Shakespeare is a big fan of a sexual innuendo, which is one of the types of puns. So if you're interested in clicking on that link, that will take you to a video of a song called Brush Up Your Shakespeare, which makes puns of a bunch of Shakespeare titles. A direct address is when words tell the reader who is being addressed. So if I were to say like, "Samantha, do this," that would be me using a direct address because I'm using that person's name. Then we're going to get into a bit of the irony. You just studied irony with Of Mice and Men, so now we're going to apply it to theater, and we have dramatic irony that's included here. So dramatic irony is a contradiction between what a character thinks and what the audience knows to be true. So they think one thing, we know another. It builds suspense, it builds the irony, it builds the excitement. Think about watching a horror movie and you know the killer is right behind them and you're like, "Oh my God, turn around." Or they run upstairs and they should have gone downstairs, right? Or think about when watching a comedy and you realize, "Oh my gosh, you know what's coming and this person's about to get into so much shenanigans." But you know it and the character doesn't. That is also irony, dramatic irony. Verbal irony is when words are used to suggest the opposite of what is meant. Sarcasm is a type of verbal irony. Verbal irony can also be used as a way to fool or trick someone, as we see sometimes in Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies. Situational irony is when an event occurs that is opposite of what is expected. So we have dramatic, verbal, and situational irony. Comic relief exists in this play as well, and in fact, this image on the screen right now is from Romeo and Juliet. This is the nurse, who is a character in Romeo and Juliet, kind of like a nanny or caregiver for Juliet, who's raised her. She was her wet nurse when she was a baby. And the nurse's character is a type of comic relief. So something that provides a little bit of relief from all the sadness. Pay attention to the fact that in order for it to be comic relief, it has to be in a drama or in a history. It can't be in a comedy. Comedy is funny by nature, so it doesn't need comic relief, but comic relief does occur in a genre that is not naturally comedic. Notice also in this image, here's an example of the nurse being played by a man who is not kind of younger with finer features and higher voice. This is hitting that comedy aspect I talked about earlier. All right, speaking of comedies, Shakespeare wrote 17 of them. Definitionally speaking, to be a comedy, it has to have a happy ending. That's not to say that there are areas of it that aren't funny or there are areas that are sad. It just has to end with a happy ending. Typically, Shakespeare's comedies end in the form of a wedding or a marriage. They're more lighthearted than a lot of Shakespearean works. Lots of different styles of comedy used. These images here are from an Oregon Shakespeare Festival production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is probably my favorite of Shakespeare's comedies. There's a much larger emphasis on the situations in comedies than there are the characters themselves. If things happen to characters that we have a connection to and that we start to feel a lot of empathy for, and then they go through some terrible misfortune, it would be hard for us to laugh at them, right? Like sometimes it's hard to laugh at Michael Scott because we really love him, but oh my gosh, he makes a fool of himself. So when we meet the characters in Shakespeare's comedies, it's more situational as opposed to letting us really connect to the characters so that we don't feel bad for them. We feel okay just laughing at them because they're being stupid. Often the comedies have some kind of a struggle of young lovers to overcome a difficulty. Usually that difficulty is represented by elders in society, and then the lovers have to separate, and then they reunite, and it's a happy ending with a wedding. Comedies often have deception among characters, such as mistaken identity. We see a clever servant as a trope of the comedies. There's lots of dispute between the characters. Often these are familial disputes. Again, think back to those young lovers. And lots of intertwining plot lines. Lots of intertwining plot lines that kind of cross and mix and go all over the place, which keeps us kind of on our toes and excited and in it. Shakespeare does like all types of comedy. Slapstick, which is like physical comedy. Puns, which are like the double meaning words and the double entendres. Dry humor. So think like British humor, standard British humor, dry humor. Earthy humor, by that I mean dirty humor. Shakespeare loves a dirty joke. If you think it's a dirty joke, it's probably a dirty joke. Witty banter or wordplay, as well as practical jokes. So tons of different styles of comedy in Shakespeare's works. And comedy, by definition, has to have a happy ending. If it doesn't have a happy ending, it's not a comedy, even if it's a tragedy with some funny moments. We have some funny moments in Romeo and Juliet, but we don't have a happy ending, therefore not a comedy. The tragedies are my favorite of Shakespeare's genres. The tragedies are not funny in nature, though they sometimes have comic relief. In the tragedies, our protagonist has a fatal flaw. They have a weakness that is going to eventually lead to their downfall. This upper picture here is of Othello. His fatal flaw is jealousy. Jealousy and pride are his fatal flaws. The lower picture is Macbeth. Macbeth's fatal flaw is his desire for power and his blind ambition to do anything he needs to get that power. So these are the things that are going to lead to the character's downfall. So pay attention as you read Romeo and Juliet. What are their fatal flaws? What is going to lead to their downfall? Also, it's important to note that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. The more important they are in the plot, the more power they have in the society as characters, they're going to have a further fall from grace, often death, because it's Shakespeare's tragedies. Most people will die. And the protagonist is going to face a variety of external pressures that are going to make their lives much harder. These could be fate, they could be evil spirits, they could be manipulative characters, lots of external pressure. Society is an important external pressure that we see in tragedies as well. The histories are not historically accurate. However, they're definitely inspired by historical events and historical figures. What they actually are is social commentary that kind of explores the social structure. So someone couldn't just outwardly complain about or speak down about royalty, but you could write a play with fictional characters that represented those aspects of royalty almost as like caricatures for those people, and then show bad things happening to them or criticize their flaws in that way. It was a way of kind of a cheeky way to be able to get that commentary. But they are set against medieval English history. There are a variety of histories. They are excellent, I will say. I feel like often people skip them because they think they're boring. But I will let you know they are not. You just need to find the right production of one. All right, there's many adaptations of Shakespeare's works. So on this slide here, if you want to click through them, I've got some movie trailers that are linked on YouTube to kind of watch and then ask yourself, is it a comedy? Is it a history? Or is it a tragedy? And how do you know? So what I have here is 10 Things I Hate About You. I have O, which is a fantastic movie. She's the Man, which many of you have probably seen. West Side Story. And then my personal favorite is The Lion King. So just some adaptations of Shakespeare's works. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list, but if you're interested, you could totally Google a comprehensive list and you would find some real great stuff. And also on here, I have that we've adapted a lot of his language as well. There are so many words and so many phrases that Shakespeare invented because it was something that he felt would say what he wanted to better than the language that already exists that we've really kept. A piece of work, right? What a piece of work is man. We still say that if something's oh man, she's a piece of work. Right? Off with his head, that's become important. If something's a sorry sight, or if you've met a green-eyed monster, if you feel like you're the laughing stock of the world, or if you tell someone they have a heart of gold, you say goodbye to someone, you don't want to see him again, and you say, good riddance, knock, knock, who's there? All of these things are invented by Shakespeare. I will actually link for you a YouTube video of a song that a friend of mine wrote and performed in a cabaret that really takes all of Shakespeare's common day language that we've kept around and puts it in the context of song. It's a fun one. So I'll link that for you so that you can appreciate that as well. All right. So hopefully this has given you a bit of an overview of Shakespeare and of the genres, the histories, the tragedies, the comedies. Hopefully you have a chance to watch some of these videos and YouTube videos, the trailers, and get an idea of kind of what we can see as when it comes to adaptations of Shakespeare's work. All right, friends, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoy watching Romeo and Juliet.